So I now have the great privilege of introducing my friend and colleague, Dr. Rob Turrisi. Rob is a professor of biobehavioral health and also has a joint appointment in the Prevention Center at Penn State University. I've had the good fortune to collaborate with him for a number of years, I can't remember quite how many, on research that is designed to improve college student health and alcohol use and substance use specifically. Rob is extremely well-published and well-funded in the area primarily of parent interventions for alcohol and substance use in college populations and young adult populations. He also has done really important work working with parents as well as medical providers to reduce skin cancer rates in young adults. Today, Rob is going to talk with us about some of his parenting research in the area of college drinking prevention. I'm really excited to have him here.
Hello, is my mic on? Can everybody hear? Okay, good. Because I've now done my job officially. I turned on the slides and I checked to see if my mic was working really well. I thought about a lot of things while Mary was speaking, and I really thought about coming up here and just saying, I agree with everything she said, and then just walking away, because she did such a wonderful job. So the first person I want to thank is Mary, because she was the one that invited me here. I also want to thank the Department of Psychology for having and hosting me here. I especially want to thank Dana for organizing everything so that I could actually get here. And I want to thank the Edwards family, because this is a rich tradition to be able to do this. So I really appreciate all of you being here, and I appreciate their support for making that possible. So, underage drinking, why parents may be more important in ways than we think. I started this work a very, very long time ago. Actually, I started in the early 1980s. And when I started it, there was no internet, there were no cell phones, there were yellow pages and different things like that. And I was studying behavioral decision making, and I was mostly interested in, do people really know when they're too drunk to do anything, including drive or have another drink and things like that? And I was looking at decision making models along those lines, and I spent a lot of time then transitioning into working with teenagers, because I felt like teenagers were an opportunity for prevention. And the reason why I did that is I worked with alcoholics and a lot of older people, and I kind of realized that they were hard to change, and at the time I really wanted to make a difference. I thought, I'll do something that seemed like it's easy to do. I'll change adolescents. And that's where my career started. And I thought, well, this is going to work. And at that time, I had some crossroads and decisions to make. And one approach that I could do is I could work with schools, because that's where teenagers are most of the time. Or I could work with families and communities, because that's where there are none of the time. And I decided, well, let me work with the easier of the two groups, families and communities. So I also thought that I would work with them for about 20 years. I'd be in my mid-40s. And at that time, I would change careers and not be a psychologist anymore and be a fly fishing guide or something like that. And I asked my girlfriend, then my wife, who's in the audience, is that okay? And she said, sure. And when I hit my 40s, I was so disillusioned by the fact that there was still a problem, and I still was trying to change people's behavior, and I wasn't yet a fly fishing guide. So I have about 7 or 8 years left, I think, to do this, and I am really hoping that I could be a fly fishing guide sometime. So let me talk a little bit about what I'm going to do, and I've changed a lot in terms of the way I think about this. So I've become much more pragmatic, and I think about all different innovative ways and not just looking at the way people make decisions, although that's the core basis of a lot of the things that I do. So I'm going to spend a little time talking about a brief overview. I'm going to talk a little bit about the science on parents, some specific strategies to maybe improve communication and increase efficacy, and then I guess that'll lead to the Q&A part of our talk today. Okay, so like I said to you, when I first started out, I was interested in young people and drinking. And as we've learned from Mary, it's very prevalent in our society to have young people drinking. And just like every other scientist, I would publish my work in the top tier journals in the field. And at that time, I really still wanted to make a difference. As much as I really enjoyed publishing papers, and I still do, I felt like the most important part was to make a difference. And every time I saw headlines about another accident, another student death, or another problem, I took that to heart that I wasn't being successful at really getting at what I wanted to do. And I still sort of feel that way myself. As Mary indicated, my career branched out to starting looking at cancer. And part of this was that I had a friend of mine say, this is a major problem and I need some help. And it wasn't that I felt like I was making the inroads for cancer, but I felt like I had still more to give. And then I published materials in the cancer journals. And that's where I've spent most of my time. The interesting thing about it is that I've learned things from both that have helped me really think about what are the best ways of trying to change people's behavior. And I might add that not only was I interested in studying the easier to change population, adolescents, using the easier way, families, I also wanted to do my interventions so that they're the briefest interventions possible, the least dosage, the least contact time with the parents and the teens. And I also wanted to reach thousands, if not hundreds of thousands and millions at a time so I can have the biggest impact. And I also wanted to have, I wanted to have the biggest reach, and then finally I would settle for nothing less than the biggest impact. And that is in fact what my goals were, and they haven't varied from that point in time. So as I was doing work with adolescents and I was doing clinical trials with parents of adolescents, I was also a new college professor. And I kept on having individuals coming to my office that did really well in my classes, and I would say to them, so what are you thinking about? You thinking about going on to graduate school, medical school? Where are you thinking? And they'd say, well, I don't know, my grades aren't that good. And I said, what are you talking about? You're getting A's all in the hardest classes. And they said, well, this is the story I heard quite a bit. In my first year of college, I drank a little bit too much. And then what followed then was they told me about the consequences. And at that time, my door was always open. It was an open policy. People could walk into my office, they could walk out of my office. Until I had this one student in particular that came to me, and she told me a story that I will never forget. And I will give you sort of the quick and maybe the PG to PG-13. I don't even know what PG-13 is anymore anyway. But she told me, unfortunately, how she was sexually assaulted multiple times when she was blacked out and didn't realize whether she was giving consent or not. She said she had to drop out of school for 1.5 years, and that she's finally coming back now to finish. And it made me think, I wonder what's out there for young people. That was time before Alan Marlatt, or just about the time when Alan had done his first large, really what I call a seminal clinical trial on this piece, proof of concept, that influenced many people. But I realized that there really wasn't anything for parents at the time. And so I started asking the students in my classes and other students, do your parents really know what you're doing? And they go, oh, no. And I say, do they know how much you're drinking? And they go, oh, no. I say, do they know the kind of problems you're getting into? And they go, oh, no. I said, do you think if they did, you might do things a little differently? And they went, oh, yes. So it made me think maybe what I should do is I should try and upwardly adapt my adolescent parent interventions for college students. And when I did that, I had my supportive colleagues say things like, that won't work. And at the time, actually, it turns out that, David Hawkins and Rico Catalano published a paper that basically said that parents were really not that important and that peers were everything. And while their work didn't say, don't bother to study parents, people interpret it that way. And it created a lot of hardship for trying to do work in that area. Another colleague said, well, that might be the worst idea I ever heard. Okay, to which I said, well, your kid just turned 18. It's not like a light switch that you stop caring about them, right? And they went, well. Then another one said, well, you have a nice career going with studying parents of adolescents. Are you sure you want to do this? And I was like, I think so. So I did some pilot studies, and the pilot studies started working. Now, again, I was an early career professor, and I got the results and the data, and I looked at my data, and it's like 6:30 in the evening on a Friday, and I'm looking, and I start seeing that the effects are working. and that for the parents who received materials that talked to their kids drank less and had fewer problems than the parents that didn't. And I wanted to tell someone, so I left my office and I was running up and down the hallway to basically dark, blank offices on a Friday night. I had no one to tell. And it wasn't like I could call, so I did what I normally do. I called my wife, and the line was busy. This was before you can actually break in. And that meant, I knew exactly what that meant. That meant that I had to drive home if I wanted to talk to her. So, but that gave me hope that this actually would make a difference. And I'm sitting here talking in front of you, so if it didn't really work, then I probably wouldn't be here today. Fast forward 25 plus years, and Google. Now, a lot of people have different feelings about Google, but I flat out love them because you can find out anything you want in 2.3 seconds. And so here's what I learned, that if you do Google, you get 95 million hits on college student drinking. You get 33 million hits on college student drinking prevention. So you kind of know what those other 60 million hits are about, okay? They're not preventing drinking. They're talking about drinking games and so on and so forth. And 40 million hits on parent-based college drinking interventions, which is up from 5 million just a few years ago, which means that parents are gaining a lot of traction in this area. And it makes me think, and I'm not here to pat myself on the back, but it wasn't that long ago when I heard people say, that won't work. That's the stupidest idea I've ever heard. And you sure you want to do this? You have a good career going. So I think that's kind of cool that this is the case. In fact, so cool that for most people that are studying parent-based intervention, doing work in this area, have no idea that I was the fool that decided to try this. So we move ahead a little bit. I know this clicker is going to work eventually. So I've done work in the epidemiology and etiology to understand the relationship between parent and different parent components and whether or not they're associated with college student drinking. I've looked at efficacy and proof of concept when I've looked at brief interventions that I talked about, which is minimal dosage, trying to reach maximal people to have the largest impact. I've turned those efficacy studies into effectiveness and targeted applications, and the dissemination of this work is worldwide. I've done adaptations of this work for Mothers Against Drunk Driving, and I understand that the information that is being disseminated now reaches a new parent family every 20 minutes. So by the time I'm done speaking, there's going to be several new families that are going to have access to these evidence-based materials. The wonderful thing about them that I'll get into is that they are inexpensive and they are easy to implement. They cost less than 30 cents and sometimes free per household. Evidence-based information that actually is shown to work in now over 10 large-scale clinical trials at the cost of less than it would cost to make a phone call on a payphone, if you can find one. It's a keystroke. A university could implement these simply with one keystroke to send the electronic versions to every single parent for the incoming freshman class with the right programming skills. And then they could have it. So for less than what would be the bottle of a small package of Tylenol that you can get in an airport, you can have evidence-based interventions in the homes of every family. So at this point, I want to disclose something, that the MAD materials that are being disseminated, which are adapted versions of the work that I do, are underwritten by Nationwide, and so they are free and available to families. So when people contact me and say, how do I get a hold of these? I say, well, you have a choice. You can have the version that costs about 20 to 30 cents per family, or you can have the one that's free. It's up to you. And they always want to know about the one that's free. Can you believe that? So shifting over, you learned a lot from Mary about high-risk drinking. I won't repeat most of this, but I do want to point out a few things. Alcohol use in our culture for young people is ubiquitous. It's everywhere there is. It would be really hard for young people to have a social life, even with them being non or moderate drinkers, to not get exposed to alcohol throughout college. It is almost everywhere they are. Students have turned a drug into a game. The role of parents and peers. Peer influences are undoubtedly the most important influence on a young person's life when they get to that age and when they get to college. But there's also elevated opportunities to drink on college campuses. On the campus that I'm at, you could walk from one end of the campus to the other end of the campus, and there's 120 different places where you can get a beer. There's 3 places where you can get an apple, okay, within 2 blocks of the campus. So you walk up and you're walking down, and that's not even including the fraternity houses, which extend to 4 or 5 blocks, which I believe there's close to 100. So there's a lot of places to get a beer. There's very few places to get an apple. You do the math. Why do students drink on our campus? Well, for the reasons that Mary cited, but one reason that's kind of an important reason to point out, and that is that they are willing to experience the consequences and see that almost as just what you have to pay to have a good time to go out. And so for a lot of the things that we think of as consequences, that we call consequence, that we call problem, that doesn't register as a consequence or a problem. We've done studies where we've asked them, how negative is it, or how do you feel about having things like blacking out, vomiting, getting so sick you pee yourself, falling, injury? These are not seen as negative experiences. At best, they're seen as neutral experiences. And in most cases, they're seen as positive experiences. So they're willing to experience this. So to change their behavior, we have our work cut out for us. There's also reduced social controls, which brings it to the work that I do. There's a parent that's doing keg stands in the alley. Going back to the one drink, that's a dad with a drink visiting. And there's a mom, and she's doing what we call keg stands. Now, I have a colleague, my closest colleague, Kimberly Mallett, that I associate with. When she looks at this picture, she doesn't see the mother doing keg stands with her son and his friends at a back-to-school event. She looks and says, how could she be doing that with pink pumps on? Brings us to our college campus. And as Mary talked about, not everybody's drinking and not all the time, even though that may be the perception. On the left side, we have what we see on our campuses most weekdays, Monday through Friday, during the day. On the right side, we see what happens on weekends in many places. So during the day, the norm is healthy academic, social experiences. And on weekends, the experience is to go out and have a good time and see what happens and be willing to experience the consequences to experience those good times. The interesting thing about this is I have a colleague, Larry Sternberg, that says, young people, we spend a lot of money and a lot of time trying to change their behavior, and their brains are not yet fully developed. And so a lot of the efforts that we place are not well spent. And we should spend more time trying to figure out efforts that really change, that are consistent with brain development. And I remember being at a talk, and my talk was given later in the day because first we had to talk about the biological effects, then we had to talk about the clinical impact, and then when that was all done, we talked about the prevention efforts. And I watched Larry basically provide the counterpoint to a lot of people's efforts to say young people's brains are not fully developed. And I knew my turn was coming when I would get to the prevention efforts. But I thought about this because I had a nice break at dinner to be able to come back and give my talk. And I realized that it's not that their brains are not fully developed. It's that their brains are interacting with the environment that they're in. And what's normal during the day, Monday through Thursday, are that students are here to learn. And they're very polite, they'll hold doors open for you, and they'll say please and thank you and all the different things. But then on weekends, when there's fewer adult role models for what's appropriate behavior, it's a little bit like the Lord of the Flies. Whoever's holding the conch is in charge of what's appropriate behavior. And most older adults head for the hills. They're not downtown at most college campuses. And then come Sunday, when the weekend's over, they're back to holding the doors open, saying please and thank you, and studying and having this experience. So it's clear that the connectivity is there, and their brains are developed, but based on the environment that they're in, the connectivity is not necessarily sufficient for the pressures that are there. And so, because their brains are still developing, parents, when I first started doing this work, my thinking was that parents were communicating the values of their families. And what I've realized that these communications do more than convey the family's values. They're actually helping strengthen the connectivity, so that when their students are in those high-risk environments, they have the capacity to not have to go along and change and be themselves. So parents' roles are not just to convey values, but rather to help with this self-regulatory behavior, which in turn is a proxy for brain development. And if they could behave like very mature, caring, giving adults during the week, then there's really no reason why they can't do that on the weekend. So, like I mentioned before, my initial ideas were to look at research questions like how do college students think about drinking and non-drinking alternatives. I noticed that a lot of interventions failed, and part of the reason they failed is because they were able to make drinking a more negative alternative, but it still was the most positive alternative as to what to do. So some students were like, look, I know that drinking's not good for me. I know that going out over weekends and drinking to the point where I can't remember really what I did over the weekend is not good for me. But it's the best way for me to meet people. It's the best way for me to go out and have a good time. And so we had to think about not only making the alternative of drinking slightly more negative, but we had to also increase the positive value of other options. And I did studies where I looked at people's perceptions of, say, going to a coffee shop versus going to the coffee shop and pre-gaming and drinking beforehand, going to a sporting event or going to a sporting event and drinking beforehand, going to see a musical performance or going to see a musical performance and drinking beforehand. And interestingly, students rated all of the experiences much better if alcohol was involved. And so we also had to correct some of those perceptions as well. Another question I was really interested in when I first started doing the work with college students was, what are parent-teen reactions to their parents being involved? So how do students feel about this? Parents' perceptions were that they weren't going to like it very much if they were involved. So we asked their sons and daughters, how would you feel if your parents were involved? How would you feel if they talked to you more about this topic? And interestingly, we found out that the teens' perceptions of this were far less negative than what parents actually thought. And this was important because we had to convey to parents that it's okay to talk to your kids about this topic. No one had ever done this before. And so we had to sort of help them along because their perception was, if we start talking to them, they're going to, this isn't going to work at all. Fast forward now to where we are today, and the average college student communicates with their parents several times a day via cell phone. They're constantly texting their parents. And usually it's because they need more money. The third one is, how do parents influence these drinking, how do parents influence drinking cognitions, which are the thoughts students have about drinking, and consequences? And we started looking at associations. And interestingly, the more parents that were involved in positive ways, the less individuals drank, even without intervention materials. So we kind of felt like, based on the science, we had something to go on here. By the way, we had to publish some of these papers in order to convince, quite frankly, our colleagues that it was okay to do parent-based intervention. So there's a lot of previous work that we had to do. Fast forward, and actually, I've done more now than 10 years of clinical trials with parents, but we've looked at multiple sites, incoming freshmen, high-risk populations. These are students that are either from groups that have been known to have difficulties, such as student athletes and fraternity students, to individuals who've already been in trouble for drinking. And we've looked at, will parents implement interventions and will it work? Will the PBI change culture in high-risk environments? Will the PBI affect transitions between different types of drinkers when they get to college? Will the PBI decrease incidences of sexual assaults and other consequences? Do combined interventions work? And this is one of the things that I think is fantastic and wonderful. is that I think it was about 10 or 12 years ago, Mary and I collaborated on a project where we gave individuals different forms of the work that she talked about, where we had individuals who were peers that delivered the basics intervention. We had mailed interventions given, and we did parent-based interventions. And the combined, spoiler alert, the combined interventions worked better than either one of them alone. And that was really interesting because that was a very easy intervention to implement, and then the parent one was a very easy one to implement. There's a lot of peers around. Surprise, surprise, many schools have moved away from peer-based interventions. There were a lot of schools that were interested in training, giving student internships, but they moved away from that model in part because they've moved to more computer-delivered, easier to implement, less effective, but easy to do projects. And we've also looked at the dosage of interventions, parent-based interventions, and the best timing as to what time to give them to students. And I'll share some of the findings. I just want to give you sort of an overview of where things are. And based upon these 10 plus years of all these clinical trials, I think what we have now is a body of evidence that indicates that it's not about will parents make a difference. It's about what the nature of that impact will be and for whom does it work better versus less, and then in what combination does it work. So we get back to the brain's development, self-regulation. I've been studying lately proxies for brain development. And I've noticed that in situations for self-regulation, that when we do parent-based interventions, not only do the students drink less and have less consequences, but they actually cope better, they have higher self-regulation. And it really seems to indicate that these parent interventions, as minimal and brief as they are helping self-regulation, and which are proxies for brain development, brain maturation. I piloted a couple of talks that I gave to communities as well as scientific audiences about this concept of are parent-based interventions actually affecting brain development? And it was particularly interesting to see that when I did this in communities, and I was talking to parents and other community leaders, after it was done, I thought that they'd ask me, questions about, well, how do you know it worked? And how did this happen? Like kind of sort of the procedural questions. And they all want to know more about brain development, how to change brain development. Whereas when I gave these talks to scientific audiences, they were less interested in how it affected brain development and more interested in how much it cost and how many effects and what it was and things like that. So it's kind of funny. I really thought when I went to the communities I wouldn't get that much interest, but apparently that was a really hot topic, which just goes to show, by the way, I'm talking into a mic like this mic works. I got one on my thing, it's conditioning. It just goes to show you as scientists, a lot of times things that we find out, we trip over them. We really don't. We have ideas about what's going to work and what's not, but. So the intervention, let's talk a little bit about what this intervention, like I said, it's a brief intervention. It was designed so that parents could read it cover to cover in 15 to 20 minutes. It was designed for parents to have an 8th grade reading level. And it really was designed for them to be able to, it was typical families. And it was a written materials. At the time, we were being asked to create videos and VHS tapes. And I remember the first decision that we had to make was, would we use VHS if we did this or Sony Betamax? And there was a great debate in our lab, and I think Sony Betamax won, and I just ruled that out. And part of the reason why I ruled it out, and why I really liked the materials rather than having videos and training guides, was that I felt that families would get more from reading the materials than watching videos. I find myself all the time constantly rewinding when I'm doing training videos and doing things like that. And then because I'm old and I lose my place, I just go, and I just walk away. The other thing is that if parents don't identify with the actors and actresses that are families, then it misses that point. Whereas if you read things, you get to superimpose your own imagery about your own family. And so I've really tried to resist moving away from reading. And it's not because I'm an academic, but it's rather because I think that they're potentially more effective that way. The next thing about the materials is that they're targeted to change parents' motivations, their knowledge, and their skills. So what I want to do is I want to change what motivates a parent to communicate about what topics and in what way. And so to do that, we had to do a lot of research, seminal research, to really understand parent motivations to talk or not talk, and which ways we did. I also, even though interventions, and this was something I had to be very careful about because you heard from before, there's a lot of science that shows that increasing knowledge doesn't change behavior. But we really did need to get parents up to speed on what actually was going on and what the risks were. So we did have to cover and educate them because many parents were simply unaware of the amount of drinking that was going on and the problems that existed on our campuses. And they had a lot of misperceptions about what was safe and what was not. And then skills. We want to be able to provide parents with actual skills because we learned from some of our earlier studies, it's not what you say, but the manner in which you say it. And the manner in which you say it could quite be more important. We know that in the scientific world, but in the everyday parent world, sometimes that's not the case. Parents oftentimes want to tell their kids what to do. And they also want to say things like, and if you don't do that, here's the consequences. And it's really interesting because everything we know about ethical development and morality is that early on, kids do things because right and wrong, getting in trouble, not getting in trouble. And then as they develop, they do things because it's better for the world. And the first time that adults or young adults get in trouble, parents resort back to punishment. And punishment is not necessarily a motivator. It's a motivator not to get caught. And so we had to break the mold of parents simply punishing their kids for consequences. But it is interesting to note the one punishment that seemed to have an effect was guilt, okay? And I kind of remember my parents and my grandparents, and sometimes their most effective way to get us to change was just say, I'm so disappointed. It's funny how effective that can be. So, and of course, I never fell too far away from behavioral decision-making theory. So the materials, even though they seem like short, brief reading materials, there's a lot of really good science in these pages. And the theoretical model that I follow, if I could use this prize pointer, I think I could do this, is that the materials, the parent-based intervention group, is going to affect how they communicate in general, drinking-specific communications, when they're not the same thing, general expectancies about what's safe and what's unsafe, communication practices. Oh no, the battery's going away. Communication, trust me, I'm pointing at communication practices right now. The styles, and then different behaviors like monitoring, modeling, and permissiveness. Permissiveness meaning letting your kids drink at home under controlled situations, where we found in study after study after study that there really is no effective way of teaching your young sons and daughters how to drink safely. In fact, quite the opposite. For most families, even small amounts are usually associated with kids drinking heavier and more frequently when they're not with their parents, and experiencing 2 to 3 times as many consequences per drinking event. I know that sounds a little counterintuitive, how something small like just a glass of wine or beer on special occasions or holidays and things like that would have such an effect. But we've compared families and we found that they're very consistent, not only over here in the United States, but in other countries such as many of Europe as well. And that these parenting behaviors and practices will influence the teens' attitudes or the students' attitudes, their beliefs about alcohol, the norms, attitudes towards alternatives, self-efficacy, that they in fact can resist the opportunities in the environments at high risk, their own self-regulatory activity, which is proxies for brain development, and them engaging in protective actions as opposed to risky behaviors, which in turn changes their perceptions of how willing they are to drink and experience consequences, which in turn reduces drinking and consequences. It's actually quite simple. I think, and I think it's one of the coolest things in the world, to be honest with you. All right, that being the case, the materials that we've designed for high school students differ from the college students in really some very fundamental ways. The materials for the high school students, we felt like their students are living in the home of the parents have a lot of contact time, so they really could develop these intervention and the components over time. Whereas the materials that we developed for college students, we envision this way, that Janie or Johnny would get accepted into State University and get a letter saying, this is great, congratulations, you're going to be broke for the rest of your life. Jamie and Johnny's mother and father would get a letter saying, you've done a great job, congratulations, it's wonderful, but here at State University, we take a proactive approach. Be unique, stand apart from the crowd. While we know a lot, not a lot of parents do this stuff. You can help reduce your kids' risk. Here's something, read these materials, use these as a source of guidance. So we really developed them with the intent of them being used during freshman orientation, first-year student orientation. And I remember when I piloted these, I asked for about 15 minutes of parents' time during the student's first-year orientation. And the person that ran orientation looked at me and said, what do you mean? We basically give the parents a list of places to shop downtown and a list of restaurants they can go, and then we don't see them again for the rest of the day. And I was like, well, why don't we keep them for 15 minutes before we give them that list? And then we could talk about this and give them these materials. And they went, I don't know if we could do that. I was like, sure you can. So that was our first pilot study where we did that. And I am happy to report that parents are now a part of almost every first-year experience in the United States, okay? But I will confess, when our oldest child got into, Penn State and went to Penn State, there was a line, and the parents were on one line going to the parent orientation, and the students were on another line going to the student orientation. My wife's right there, Hillary. As we got close to that point where we were going to walk into the room for the parent orientation, I did this. And Lori said, where are you going? And I said, I work here. I know what they're going to talk about. It's my stuff. And she goes, well, I want to learn about the courses. And I said, okay, I'll meet you at the waffle shop for lunch. So not all parents engage in this process. And that just means that we have to come up with different ways to motivate them to go and do these things. But the point is that we do increase their knowledge, we do increase their motivation, and we do increase their skills. And that is, in fact, the differences between the materials for that. They're really designed to be very short and very brief. And the specific components within the topics are designed to address parents' reluctance to talk about alcohol. They're designed to teach parents how to talk about how alcohol actually does work in the body. Despite the fact that within 2.3 seconds you can learn a lot, there's a lot of misinformation about what alcohol does in your body and what it doesn't do. And so it's really hard for parents to get access to this information other than going, say, to the NIAAA website. Physical and psychological effects, setting limits, reasons why teens drink and reasons why they don't drink. So we talk about all the reasons why students really like to drink and want to drink, and then reasons why they don't, and then so on. And these are targeted outcomes that are direct factors, psychological constructs that we're trying to change in the teen that we know if we do, they will be less willing to drink, less willing to experience consequences, and so on. So feedback we hear from the parents that work with us, I don't expect you to read all these balloons. And by the way, I didn't handpick just the best ones. Maybe I handpicked some of the better ones, but most of the comments that we hear from parents are really quite positive. The negative comments are, they're kind of long. You could shorten these a little bit, and we have. So we started off with our materials being about 50 pages, and those 50 pages went to 20-something pages, and then the 20-something pages went to the teens pages, and then I figured something out, that if I just print it on smaller paper, instead of printing it on 8 by 11, 8 by 8, and I could actually even increase the number of pages, parents go, oh, thank you for reducing the length of that. So we've done that as well. We're tricky that way. So I want to talk a little bit about the science here. Does it work? Does it work by families? Why does it work? Does it work in high-risk environments? Does it work for high-risk individuals? And is it affecting changing risk profiles? That last one is kind of important, near and dear to my heart, so I'll say something about that initially. We know for a fact that many of the students that come to our campuses already come with existing drinking habits that they started before they came here. We know that for a fact. In fact, many college presidents that I have had a chance to speak with feel that if students didn't come to campus, they wouldn't have as many problems as they do, okay? So I'm interested in, no matter what students come to campus with, can they still be changed? And it turns out that the data show that it's never too late, and you can move kids from high-risk profiles to low-risk profiles, which means you're moving kids out of risk. And I think that's kind of fascinating work that I'll talk about later if I have time. So, does it work? Here's one of our studies with about 1,000 families. 500 of the families came from the west coast of the United States. 500 families came from the east coast of the United States, and the students went all over the west coast, and they went all over the east coast to all size colleges and universities. And we followed them up, and we looked at their behavior in the fall and the spring. The red bars are the students whose parents received the materials and talked to their sons and daughters. The gray bars are the ones that didn't. And the data show that it's not quite twice as much drinking going on, but it's a clinically significant difference between the groups. And that these differences, based on these real brief conversations that happen before the kids leave for school, they are sustained up to a year later. In this case, it's 9 months later. And these effects on weekend drinking, we see when we look at other behaviors as well. So heavy episodic drinking, red bars are always lower than the gray bars. Heavy episodic refers to when students have males 5 or more drinks in a 2-hour window and females have 4 or more in a 2-hour window. We see it for incidences of driving impaired. We see it for smoking cigarettes as a secondary effect, where we don't ever have them talk about cigarettes, but they smoke less cigarettes. And so on. Marijuana is one of those, but I took the slide out because I know I didn't have a lot of time to talk about all the different behaviors. Does it work for different families? And so we looked at, is it stronger for some families and weaker for others? And this one is positive communication practices. And I want to show you a little bit about this slide. I hope we get green. Okay, so this red line here, these are for parents who get the materials. The yellow line are for parents who don't get the materials. So we're comparing these two. These represent different types of parents with respect to communication practices prior to getting the materials. So these represent parents that are typical. These are parents that are above average, really good communicators. And these parents are the ones that are below average, slightly not quite as good parents. And so if you look at the parents who are above average communicators who get the materials, their kids drink much less on Saturday nights than the parents that are above average but don't get the materials. And actually, if you look at each of these, that same pattern shows itself. What was really cool for me when I really thought about this making a difference is that if you look at that line represents the worst case scenario for parents who get the materials. And in each case, the effects are stronger when parents get the materials for reducing than they are when they don't. And it's interesting because remember, I was the parent that when my kid went to college, I went like this, okay? If I didn't know what I know, I'd say, well, I'm a pretty good communicator. I could do a really good job. I probably don't need these materials. And I would be raising the kid that was at much higher risk than the parent that's similar to me, but yet used the materials as the base of that information. While I'm surprised by that effect, in some ways I'm not, considering the material that went into it, which is to change the knowledge, the motivation, and the skills, and it has very strong theory behind it, and it targets specific activities that make a difference in young people's lives. The same thing happened when we looked at other parenting behaviors, such as monitoring. The same thing happened when we looked at parent permissiveness and parent approval. So in each case, when we looked at for whom does it works better even if in families where there is poor communication at the outset, poor modeling, and poor monitoring, which really says something's good. Why does it work? Well, it works because it's consistent with the theoretical variables. We're targeting specific outcomes, components, and the materials, the content, It affects the targeted outcomes that these materials are designed to be associated with. So when we reduce parents' reluctance to talk about alcohol, we're more likely to see better effects. When we get parents to understand how alcohol works in the body and conveys it to their sons and daughters, we see better effects, and so on down the line. And these variables increase or decrease consequences, increase protective behaviors in high-risk drinking. There are also proxies for the self-regulation and the brain development. Does it work in this Project ACT, where we looked at individuals that are hard to reach, that are different? Again, the first profile shows a kid that drinks 1 drink a night, every night of the week, and another one shows a kid that drinks 6 or 7 drinks in one night. And obviously, they drink the same number of drinks, but they drink differently. And if my intervention only really changes the number of drinks, I don't really know if it's having the effect like I want, okay? Because it could be reducing that 1 drink per night to a half a drink, but it's really not affecting the large consumption that happens on a Saturday night. So we looked at different types of profiles, and we looked at the number of past drinks that they have in the past month, that number of times they're drunk in the past month, binge drinking, high BACs, weekday drinking, Thursday night drinking, and weekend drinking. And from those assessments, we're able to discern 4 different types of drinkers when they show up at college. Non-drinkers, weekend drinkers, but they don't binge, weekend binge drinkers, and then heavy drinkers that drink basically all the time. And so our goal for this particular study was to get the individuals that are heavy drinkers to become weekend drinkers, the weekend binge drinkers to become non-bingers, and the weekend non-bingers to stay there or become non-drinkers, and to try and keep it. In other words, to my knowledge, this was the first intervention that really had 2 goals. The first goal would be to keep the individuals who are safe at the levels that they're safe. And we know for a fact, when students come to college, everybody tends to increase a little bit. And at the same time, we wanted to see, is it too late, or can parents still make a difference from their kids when they get to college? And that is exactly what we found. We found that high-risk heavy drinkers transitioned out of that profile if their parents read these materials and used these to guide their conversation. So kids that were heavy drinkers in high school became less heavy drinkers in college, even under these high-risk environmental conditions. We also found that weekend binge drinkers transitioned out of that profile. So the 2 riskiest drinkers reduced their drinking, and we kept the individuals who were at the lowest risk in their group. So my time is up here, and I have more to share with you. And I'll just give my slides to the folks here at UW so that you can put them on a web page and show them to parents. And you can always reach me at my email. I'm really good about replying back because I can talk about this stuff forever. You could Google me, you'll find me really quickly. Turrisi at psu.edu. So I want to go to the last piece that really makes a difference. We studied parent profiles, and this last one's an important point. It gets back to something I talked about earlier. And we found that there's 4 different types of parents with respect to the communications and their behaviors. We have one group that's considered a positive pro-alcohol group. This has high levels of mothers monitoring and positive communication, yet there are also high levels of mother and father approval that their students, it's okay for them to drink when they're early in college. Then we found a positive anti-alcohol group. They're virtually identical in terms of communication, monitoring, and modeling as the first group, except they discourage their kids from drinking and they don't let them drink at family functions and holidays and things like that in their first year of college. And then there's a group that has negative mother communication, and there's a group that has negative father communication. So there's basically this cross-section population in the United States. These are sort of the 4 groups of parents that kind of exist. What we found was that when we compared the different groups to the positive anti-alcohol, the group of parents that communicate really well, model monitoring, but don't let their kids drink, we found that the positive pro-alcohol group, they were 3.9 times more likely to be in a high-risk drinking group. Almost 4 more times likely by just simply letting your kids have access to alcohol. I call them kids. I know they're young adults. Sorry about that. But I'm getting older, so they all seem like kids to me. 4 more times more likely to be in a high-risk group that's going to experience more problems. And the only difference between them is one says, yeah, it's okay, you're in college. And the other one says, you're still underage. Keep in check. The negative father, the more difficulties, that's almost 6 times more likely to be in that high-risk group. The negative mother, less than 2 times more likely. It's interestingly that the negative father, the ones where we saw that the fathers tended to be really bad at communication and more often having alcohol problems in the home. There's not a whole lot different between the best parents, but they let their kids drink. And again, we've looked at these findings in European cultures, and the findings replicate the kind of things we do. It's really important to note, again, I think maybe it's a little unfair that something so simple creates such a high-risk environment. And I'd like to be able to say I could explain it in all these interesting ways, other than the fact that kids' brains aren't yet fully developed. And they're not just small versions of adults that can understand the behaviors in the same way that we do. Very rarely do young people get together on weekends when they drink and talk about politics and world issues and so on and so forth. And so it's really a different experience for them than it is for, say, an adult. Okay, so what makes the best parent profile? The pro-alcohol one? No. Negative mother? Not so much. Negative father? Positive anti? That's what the science shows. And it changes some of the things. So what do we know? Multiple well-controlled trials. Parents making a difference by influencing changes that influence self-regulatory behaviors on the part of the kids, and that drinking consequences are reduced and health outcomes are increased. And again, I'll repeat what I said before. This is an intervention that costs about 30 cents tops per home, and it's easily disseminated. It's kind of, I don't know, at the end of the day, what it comes down to is that this is an intervention that easily could be implemented across the country with ease. And it can be done in combination to have even stronger effects with the work that Mary's done, and just simply sending people feedback in the mail. And that would have the largest effect. In fact, it's not surprising that those 2 interventions were the one that met the most rigorous criteria for the Society for Prevention Research, and were written up in the most recent Surgeon General's report as ones that have the evidence base behind them that should be recommended. And I know that there's an individual in the audience that helped craft that message and took a lot of heat from National Institute of Health, because the feeling was that the criteria were a little bit too rigorous and that it didn't include enough interventions in those data. And with that, I will say there's a lot of people that I really need to thank here. I'll start with just saying that, like Mary, without the funding of NIAAA and the National Institute of Drug Abuse, we couldn't do this work. And so these are your tax dollars that are helping reduce your tax burden, because there is a sizable economic impact. There are also people that have gotten their Ph.D.s here at the University of Washington that are at Penn State that have made the difference here. And there's people that we've sent from Penn State to the University of Washington to help contribute to the science. So with that, I think it's time that we can let you ask us questions. Thank you.